I'll be speaking on the psychology of good documentation. It's about how to create documentation that doesn't suck, yeah? Before I move forward, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Ikechukwu. I am a technical writer focused on developer marketing and developer education at the moment. What that means is that I help a couple of tech startups kind of create documentation, create articles that helps them connect better with their target audience, that translates what they do to that target audience. So that's what I do. So before I start to share some tips on how I think that we can create better documentation, I like to look at why documentation experience is quite important for organizations here. So the first thing is that good documentation can help a company achieve their growth goals, yeah? When a developer, if your products are developer focused or even user focused, yeah? When they have problems, the first thing they are going to look at is your documentation. They're going to search to see if they can find answers in your documentation. And even the way software engineers work, when they are like evaluating tools, best tools to use for a particular use case or like a problem, the first things they look at is the documentation. How quickly can I get started with this? The getting started page. What do I need to know? Does this work for my use case? Now, if your documentation is not clear enough, you've clearly just lost a prospective user. So that's why, in a sense, documentation kind of helps you achieve your growth goals, because if your documentation are clear enough, good, accessible, it encourages people to sign up and try out your product. This image here is a graph from GitHub open source survey, and in this graph, the people that were surveyed mentioned that lack of proper documentation was one of the top reasons why they decided against using an open source product. Like, they just looked at the documentation, it was whack, and they're like, when I run into problems in the future, I wouldn't have like an anchor to find solutions from, so they just decided against using that product. And that's how critical documentation is. Another reason why documentation is very vital is that it helps you cut down support costs. So there's this company I work for. They've been having, like, prospective customers keep calling and asking, what's the difference between your cloud offering and like your self-hosted offering? They didn't have that documented, yeah? So they kind of had to take those type of calls like almost every week. Prospective users were calling to ask, how do I do this, or emailing to ask, what's the difference between this and this? Why is this better than this? What does this offer me? What does option A have that's better than option B? Why will option B be a better use case for me? They didn't have all these things documented, yeah? So I came in and I helped them to document these use cases, telling people, like, if you go for this option, this is what you get. This is why it will be a good option for you. These are instances or use cases that you can use this option for. Yeah, and that drastically cut down the amount of work their support had to do. So that's a very vital use case of documentation. It helps you save cost on support. If you have an excellent documentation, you don't need to hire several support engineers hanging around waiting for, somebody to call. People can easily find what they need from your documentation. It's very clear that documentation is quite important here. So why is it that majority of documentation actually suck, like what we've seen from the GitHub graph? I would say the number one reason is that in a lot of organizations, developers are the ones writing the documentation. And I have this agenda against Nigerian companies because they're always doing it. They feel like technical writers or like documentation engineers are not a necessity. And so they task their developers, after building product, they task the same developers who built the product to write documentation. And I would like to let you all know that that's not a very it's not advisable. It won't even work. That's why a lot of documentation we have are terrible, because there's something called the creator bias, or what we call the cost of knowledge. It simply means that if I'm heavily involved in doing something, yeah, or I'm used to doing something, I'm going to assume when I meet someone else that they have the same context or the same background knowledge that I have about something. And so that would hinder me from taking up like a learner's mind and trying to like figure out problems that people might have with this product. And so developers who build products are not in the best position to write good documentation for the same products because of the cost of knowledge. And this image here is one of my favorite things because it's clearly just shows what creator bias is all about here. You're commenting your code, you're using the same logic and the same language and the same symbols that you wrote in the code to comment the code, and then like how is a common user supposed to understand what's going on here? Why are you labeling with the same signs that are actually on the product here? So this is what happens when developers have to write documentation about products that they are building. And then another thing that happens is these people have an actual job, which is to write code and build products. And so when that will always be a priority, yeah, and at the end of the day, the documentation is just left as an afterthought. Whenever I have time, we'll pick it up and do it. And eventually, everything just starts being very terrible. Which brings me back to my major agenda for Nigerian founders and product managers, and tell your organizations to actually hire technical writers or like documentation engineers, yeah? Now that we've talked about why good documentation is important, yeah, so I mentioned that the first reasons why a lot of documentation suck is because they are written by developers who build the products. The second reason is that a lot of documentation out there, they are not like optimized for the needs of users. Now, to be able to create, it's just like when you're designing a product. If you don't get to understand why your prospective user would need a product, you won't be able to create something that is relevant for them, yeah? And that's why a lot of documentation kind of like doesn't meet its needs, because developers just come in and write this documentation from their own point of view without doing any research on what actual users need from the documentation. And so we end up with terrible documentation. And so the first thing to do when creating documentation is to try to understand who your users are, what their pain points are, what questions they would have, and cater to that. Now, there are a lot of ways to go about trying to understand your users. You can interview them, you can do user analysis, you can conduct friction sessions. There are a couple of ways to actually understand, which is not the context of this talk. But what these things help you understand is they help you like understand your users' pain points, what their knowledge gaps, what they need to know about your product. But then they don't help you understand, like it doesn't give you insights on how best to present the documentation for effective consumption. And that's where psychology comes in. That's where you have to start thinking like your users. So basically, psychology helps you get into the minds of your users, understand how they reason, and use that knowledge to create experiences that are catered to them. So I'll just take you guys through like a couple of major psychological frameworks. So there's been a lot of research done around how people read on the web and how people interact with text on the web, yeah? So there's bias called attention bias, and it's basically just saying that people only pay attention to things that are relevant to them. If I'm searching for something online, I would only pay attention to it if I feel that it's relevant for me. Yeah, so to make your documents relevant to your users, first of all, make your titles specific, yeah? Say I want to install that on my MacBook, yeah? And I go online and search how to install that on blah, blah, blah. And I see these titles. I see how to install that on Windows, how to install that on Mac, how to install that. Which would I be more likely to click on from the search results? Obviously, it's the third one, and even better, the fourth one, if the versions are aligned with the versions that I have in mind too. The next thing is to make your value proposition clear. So when you creating documentation, after the title, the next thing you're supposed to have is, what am I going to get after reading this thing? What's like the end goal of this documentation? And so up is AWS Docs. They have a title, what is Amazon S Glacier? And they don't tell me what I'm going to get out of reading it. So I'm supposed to just dive in blind and expect that. Am I going to understand how it works? Am I going to understand how to set it up? Like, what exactly do I get from this document? And below is an image of Stripe. Stripe is one document that I love very much because it's very simple and they get straight to the point immediately. And so you can see them, clearly stating out the value proposition, exactly what you're going to get after you're done reading. Now, other things you can do to make your documentation relevant for your users is to use descriptive subheadings. You include a table of content so they can easily go to wherever they want and highlight key information that will be relevant to them. Another psychological framework that affects how people read on the web is something called ambiguity aversion bias. It simply means that you and I life is hard. You and I like to avoid difficulties whenever we can, yeah? So if something is complex, we have that initial tendency to just move away from it and look for an easier option. Look at this image. These are two different images of the same story on two different publications. Considering the fact that both of them contain the same information, which are you likely to read? Exactly. And that's the thing. They actually contain the same information, like the same story. It's the same story on both of them. As this is less cluttered, the human brain is going to, favor it more than it will the other one, because this layout communicates complexity, difficulty. So I'm just going to naturally avoid it, yeah? And so when you're creating your documentation space, document space pages, these are the type of things that can get users bouncing up your page, which is one thing that, again, AWS does very terribly. There's no white spacing. They don't use white spaces a lot, which you just cite the document and you're already like, yeah, I'm going to be confused after reading this. Like I mentioned, looking at these images, they contain exactly the same thing, yeah? But you feel that this one on the right is just going to be so difficult to read, so you just leave it and favor the other one. The last psychological framework that I'm going to cater to is something called picture superiority effect. And we must have heard this a couple of times, that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and that's actually true. A lot of scientific research have been done about this, that when information is accompanied with pictures, it aids easier understanding, yeah? So if someone asks you what makes a good documentation, what makes a documentation good, this is what a couple of Google technical writers and engineers came up with. They did a lot of research, a lot of interviews, and came up with this metric. This is how you measure the quality of documentation. And if I had time to cover everything, you would notice that a lot of the things that we've discussed kind of caters to solving these problems and so that this quality is reflected in documentation. And so it's evident that creating documentation requires deliberate and delicate efforts, which brings me back to my agenda that I preach to all Nigerian founders and product managers. Please hire technical writers or hire documentation engineers, someone dedicated to handling your documentation, because just as code needs to be updated, your documentation needs to be updated and catered to frequently. Yes, thank you.